for drinks. And I'd like to introduce Ted Hicks, who's on the board of the John Locke Foundation. And Ted's going to introduce Donna King.
Good, because I have no idea who Donna Kelly is. I'm sure she's very nice, but I don't know who she is. So yes, my name is Ted Hicks. I am trying to help Brad with the Bastard Society. So because I sit on the board for the Locke Foundation, he asked me to introduce Donna. Donna's been with the Locke Foundation and the Carolina Journal for
2 years, a little more than
I
2
was
years.
going to say it's a year, but it can't be a year. It's been more than that.
2 years.
She joined us 2 years ago, and I know one of the first projects she worked on is revamping the Carolina Journal. Carolina Journal looks fantastic. If you guys are not subscribers to the Carolina Journal, it is kind of pricey, right? It's a free newspaper. You should be getting the subscription online as well. I get a daily email from the Carolina Journal. But they revamped the actual paper product. If you're old school and you like the actual paper, it's beautiful, and that's some thanks to you, Donna. So I'm glad you're with the Locke Foundation and Carolina Journal. Some of the other things I hope you get to talk about is the election night coverage that you do. That's fantastic. So I will shut up and turn it over to you, Donna.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Well, thank you for having me. I've been looking forward to this. It's nice to have a room full of free market economists. You don't find that a lot in journalism, so it's nice to see. First, I want to start off with giving you a quick update of what's happening in the legislature before we jump to our main topic. One of the things we've been watching pretty closely is the state budget. The conferees have been working on getting a final state budget together. They've already agreed on a top line of about $29 billion. And that's a 10% increase over the last budget. So we were watching those numbers pretty closely. There's a lot of policy in this budget. We don't have a look at what the final one is, but both the Senate and the House had a lot of policy in their versions. We're hearing that is causing a little bit of disagreement. They may be a little further apart than we thought they would be. So now I'm hearing end of July-ish. Before they really have something. I don't know that is the case. Maybe they're moving faster than I thought, but I think they're a little further apart than they expected to be at this point. Reg reform, I was going to have an update. I don't think there is much of an update right now. It's still sitting in the Senate Judiciary Committee. It's called HB 600 if you want to check on it, but a lot of it has to do with modifications to the authority that local governments would have over wastewater. Now, opponents of this measure have said, well, if you take away that authority, it could have a negative impact on the environment. The supporters of it say, look, we're trying to open up development for areas that have things like abandoned strip malls and things like that we want to make sure that these things can be revitalized by developers. So there are a lot of different policy pieces in that bill, but that's the one that's causing some of the disagreement right now. So that's in Senate Judiciary. Also on Tuesday, the Senate passed House Bill 750. If you've been watching that, that prohibits the use of ESG investing for state pensions. A lot of folks have been really watching that one pretty closely. I would imagine everybody here knows what ESG investing, but basically this bill says that the state is responsible for that fiduciary responsibility on the returns on the pension plan, that this is not about other motives, that this is really about the fiduciary responsibility. So that now has officially passed the legislature. So that one is going to be, the final vote I think was held today. One more that's expected to come up possibly as early as tomorrow is fairness in women's sports. The Senate moved it today. They have it in committee. It's now gone through, I believe it went through health today, and now it's going to rules, maybe on the floor by the end of the week. And that one is, it says biological males cannot compete in sports designated for biological females. They did add an amendment today that would allow biological females to play on biological males teams, because they got pushback from coaches who said, look, I have a female kicker on my high school football team. So that change, that was added in committee today on the Senate side. I believe the House already had that. So there's two concurrent bills that are moving right now. I think the Senate one is probably going to get to the finish line first. So we're going to be watching those really closely. So those are the updates I have right now. If we want to get to the issue at hand, this really speaks to me because it's something that I studied a lot of course, in college, and I've experienced it particularly, and who would have thought, since COVID, because some of the challenges that I saw as a journalist during COVID, I never thought when I was going through my education that this would be something I would experience in the United States, certainly not in North Carolina. So some of the barriers that we found as we were covering stories through the pandemic were things that, you know, were our challenges in other parts of the world, now challenges here. So one of the things that we wanted, we did that, sorry. Okay, so World Press Freedom Day was May 3rd. This is an index created by a group called Reporters Without Borders. And while ideologically I don't have a lot in common with this group, I think that their study of how journalism exists in particularly economic freedom and does not exist as much in areas that are not economically free is really important. So they create this index, I believe every 2 years, and they look at political context, the legal framework around journalism, the economic context, sociocultural, and safety. You know, because we hear more and more about journalists being injured, killed, kidnapped, whatever, more often than you would think. And you know, we're seeing an increase in that happening even just in the last few years. We live in a really prosperous time where, you know, where education is improving, poverty is decreasing, but we're also seeing that crush a little bit on journalism happening, particularly since COVID. Now Russia dropped down on their index a little bit over the last few years, particularly with Ukraine. That's something that they've been talking about. Here's the heat map of their index. Red being least free press, green being most free press. You can't really tell there, but green and yellow being different. United States is now yellow, and that's relatively new in the last few years. We dropped 3 places since 2020 in their index, and what they attributed to was first the death of 2 reporters, one of whom was in Texas on the southern border, but also the way that journalism transpired, the way news was covered during COVID. That was one of the reasons, and they could attribute it to misinformation, but you know, what you consider to be misinformation may be different depending on where you're sitting, and I think that the fact that they're recognizing it is probably a good thing, but it is alarming that Canada and the United States dropped in their index. Russia dropped 9 places in their index since the start of the Ukraine war. A lot of that because of propaganda and misinformation, things like that. But growth in economic freedom, you'll see more often in these areas that also have a free press, but that's more than just financial success. That means that you have more choices, you have more outlets, you have more entrepreneurs starting up news businesses and very target issue-specific, industry-specific news outlets. So it's beyond just local news. It's beyond the New York Times, beyond the Carolina Journal. Industries will have their own news, and they would consider that part of it. And I think we're seeing a lot of growth in that. Reporters Without Borders in their index looks at 180 different countries overall, that they found that the environment for journalism is bad in 7 out of 10 countries. I'm gonna put that in quotes because what they consider to be bad would be there are rules and laws restricting their access to public documents in many cases, restricting their access to government officials, but it can also mean that they just aren't working in a safe environment. So that's 7 out of 10. That is alarming. The United States is 45th in that list out of 180. So that's much lower than I would have expected, you know, living in that environment. But you know, we're in North Carolina, and I consider us to be a relatively safe space. But I also was at the southern border about a month ago, and I can see where that is not as safe of a place to be. We were, I was doing live shots right on the Rio Grande River, and we could see cartels just across the water, watching everything we were doing, writing down license plate numbers, waiting for us to leave so that they could come across. So I feel like we're a little bit of a bubble here, that perhaps it's not as safe as we would like it to be. You look what happens when you're right in the middle of a big story. You're not always on the corner of Jones and Blunt Street. Often you are in the middle of Portland or the middle of New York City. In Washington, D.C., I was involved in a tear gas attack accidentally, and that happens. And those are the things that really weigh on journalists as a profession that you don't really think about when you're doing those classes that you would see as much. But you know, these are all, it comes with the territory, and I think it's an important part of what we do as groups that promote economic freedom, because as we promote economic freedom, we really are promoting all other kinds of freedom, because people are more informed, they have more access to Wi-Fi, all of these other things. So here's their economic freedom right now. 31 countries are in a very serious situation, 42 in very difficult, 55 in problematic, and just 52 countries out of that 180 are in good or satisfactory working conditions for journalists, that they can get information. More often than not, the highest level that I saw in their index was access to public documents and access to public officials. And I see that every day. North Carolina really needs to revamp, examine our public records law. We run into this constantly. I am continuously going through, and actually we've talked about this too, Janine, right? I will go to the federal government for a public records request sooner than I'll go to our North Carolina government, because I'm much more likely to get a response in even one document from the Fed than I am from North Carolina. So that's something that I think we as an organization could help make sure that this hits close to home, that this isn't about what's happening in Asia, it can also be what's happening right here. Access to public documents is a huge part of that. So for the 5th consecutive year, there are 250 journalists who are in prison this year. And they are in China, Turkey, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia, and those 4 countries account for half of jailed journalists around the world. So not happening here so much. It could be not getting a records request could certainly be worse, but it's something that we all have to be watching really closely. So this Index of Economic Freedom, you're probably a lot more familiar with that in this room. This is something the Heritage Foundation does. They do a similar index to what Reporters Without Borders does. And this looks at the rule of law, which includes property rights and integrity in government and judicial effectiveness. It includes government size, government spending, the burden on individuals for their tax liabilities, all of these things, fiscal health, regulatory efficiency, business freedom, labor freedoms, monetary freedoms, and open markets. This is how Heritage rates different countries in the world on their economic freedom, because this is an important part of that press freedom that we were just talking about. So if you want to see that, you can go to heritage.org and their index. This is the heat map for that. Looks familiar, doesn't it? We just looked at the press freedom heat map, and it's very, very similar. And those are things that I think are an important part about this. In the data that was studied by Freedom House, countries that recorded a decrease in press freedom also had a 2% drop in their gross domestic product. So when we looked at the chart that we were looking at before, where the United States dropped a few points, Russia dropped a few points, other industrialized countries have been dropping in their press freedom, we're seeing a drop in their GDP as well. And it may be causal, but that's something we can talk about and be thinking about, whether the press is playing a role in helping people have the information that they need to start a business or to grow a business. And what the press, if they're being fed information, negative or positive, that's influencing business decisions every day. So a free press has a huge part of developing and really keeping a hold of economic freedom. So that's the debate, right? Is it a causality between economic freedom and press freedom, or does press freedom lead to economic freedom? Those are things that we should be really studying, and we are at Carolina Journal, because we see a direct impact every day in what we report, what we put on our website, what we talk about on the Debrief, which is our YouTube show that airs on Thursday nights. Those issues are really important as people are making decisions about public school versus private, homeschooling, where to send their kids to college, what to tell them to major in. All of these things are really important to building that economic freedom and creating the machine, the organism that leads to press freedom as well. So there was an Austrian economist who took these two indexes and overlaid them and created graphs on how we can see what economic and press freedom is doing. Here's what he found, that countries recorded that decrease in gross domestic product. The ones that are the lowest on the press freedom list are here: Venezuela, Cuba, China, North Korea, but they're also lowest on economic freedom. So there is a correlation between how free your press is and how free your economy is, and business owners and the pressure on these businesses, and to get the right information out to the people who are starting those businesses. So free markets by themselves, of course, do not guarantee press freedom. Singapore is a good example, right? They have a high level of economic freedom, very low level of press freedom. I had an interesting discussion today with the Consulate General of the Taiwan group in Atlanta. And they are working hard to try and really build a relationship with North Carolina, particularly when it comes to EV manufacturing and things like that. And I pushed him on this because I knew we'd be talking about it tonight, and say, tell me what you're seeing at home with, you know, press freedom and what it means to economic development and the relationships that you're trying to build here with states like North Carolina. And he said, well, every night you're gonna see people on the news criticizing the government and we don't do anything about it. Well, you know, I just take for granted that you wouldn't do anything about it, right? You know, that's an interesting perspective, that this is something that they talk about and that they think about, and we're on the news all the time criticizing the government. That's how we make our living. So it was an interesting discussion to me, because he said that the things that really are drawing him to North Carolina, one is our education, our labor force, how educated our labor force is. He did say he wanted to see Mandarin taught in more schools, and he wanted to have English teachers come there to build those relationships. But as we start building these economic ties that are inevitable in a global economy, press and information is incredibly important to do this. And I think we saw that so important, particularly when it came to the global pandemic. I think that we learned so much out of this process, but certainly freedom of the press, access to information, that is an important part of this process.
Do you want some water?
Hmm?
You want some water?
I'm fine, thank you though. I appreciate it. I'm getting over something, I think. One example I want to use is in Hong Kong. So we've been watching that closely, particularly people who are interested in free press. Apple Daily shut down a few years ago. I don't know if you're familiar with that process. Yes. So Apple Daily shut down a few years ago because Hong Kong imposed a new law that was against undermining, their law says undermining the government, and the editor in India was arrested. So, you know, these are things that, you know, Hong Kong and India, where we're having so many more relationships, economic relationships. I think the United States' value on a free press needs to be an export of ours, and something we need to be thinking about, because I don't know that other areas take that as seriously as we do. So we're talking about the COVID shutdowns. Oops. The Freedom House report that we were talking about earlier, they did a report called Democracy Under Lockdown, the Impact of COVID-19 on the Global Struggle for Freedom. So one of the big points of their report was to say that the press was really locked down as much as individuals and businesses, because they had very little access to data, hard data. We saw that happen in North Carolina with death reporting. They were being told, particularly through social media chains and digital marketing, or digital companies, to close down stories, to push them down in the algorithms. That was a challenge even at the local level, even with something like Carolina Journal. We would request documents constantly with absolutely no. I have 10 or 12 outstanding records requests to DHHS that are dated 2020. And that has been happening over and over and over. And I can take that exact same one and send it to the CDC, and I'll at least get an email back. I may not get all the documents, but I'll at least get an email back. And that's something that we saw happen over and over again, that I thought we were a little bit more protected from in the United States, particularly in North Carolina, that we valued a free press, that we had relationships. I could drive up to to one of these government agencies, and I could talk to somebody I knew as somebody who worked there, or at least used to work there. But that's really was not happening, particularly during COVID. Some of it is because everybody went home. Everybody worked from home and they became isolated. And that happened to journalists too, because we were living with so many question marks, that the same thing happened with news. And you were called conspiracy theorists or spreading misinformation if you questioned anything that was coming out of the government. That is not the kind of free press that we have in this country, or have really tried to have in this country, particularly here in North Carolina. So I think that this is a good opportunity to look back and say what went wrong and what went right. The number one thing that I know we can put our finger on today is our public records law. That's something that I think we really need to be talking about here in North Carolina, because there is not a time limit on how long they have to get back to you. There's not a, you have to make a good faith effort. There's no real requirements to put your arms around for public records, and I think we saw the reason for that during COVID, because we got no information out and we couldn't get information to people. Some of that is because now when we talk about school closures, we have people saying, well, the school's closed because of the 6-foot rule. Well, what's the 6-foot rule, right? Well, the 6-foot rule was what Fauci said we needed to have, and that was why we closed all the schools. Well, now he says he didn't say it. So where in this process and who decided that we needed to close schools? And that is going to be a life-changing decision for many generations. And we can't get a clear answer, an email, a rule, anything, because everybody's trying to walk it back, and we don't have the documents to show where it started and how to stop it next time. So I think the emergency order rule that came out in the last budget, that's an important piece of that puzzle. But public records really need to be something else. Something that did happen during COVID, and it really started in 2006 with the iPhone. North Carolina has lost more than 350 news outlets in the last 8 years, probably. The majority of those have been in the last 4. And that is because there were lots of 1- or 2-man bands in local news that were happening around the state, and they were ready to retire, and they just decided this was the right time. And it wasn't a time that other companies were buying up. So you have the loss of 300 individual news outlets. Now we only have 14 statewide news outlets in North Carolina, and the majority of them are coming out of Raleigh or coming out of Charlotte. So you have very few that are in local communities. We're trying to fill that gap with Carolina Journal. We're offering free content, free news stories, free coverage of the state government, but it's really up to the editor to put it in, and some of them have created a consortium of about 20 different small papers, and they share content among themselves. So unless they subscribe to Carolina Journal's Newswire, AP, or Reuters, they're getting all of their news from the exact same place, and that creates a vacuum. So then we see the rise of, there is hope in this. First, we've lost 300 news outlets. We only have 14 left. A lot of this is revenue driven, not just a desire to control the news, although I think that's part of it. As soon as the iPhone came out, people stopped buying ads, and that's a big part of it. Google Ads has replaced the main revenue stream for most local papers. And so that hasn't really happened, but what that's given rise to is nonprofit journalism. We're a nonprofit journalism outlet. There are more and more. We see the Assembly popping up, other groups are starting them, and a real rise in trade publications. So Triangle Business Journal, Individual, Site Selection Magazine, these trade publications are actually filling a lot of that gap in the news hole that we're seeing in North Carolina and really across the state. So when you have an opportunity, subscribe to whatever would be your trade magazine, because you're gonna get more news in these groups than you may even get from your local TV station. I find that I have to comb all of these groups, but it also means that more information is better. You have to be, buyer beware. You have to be judicious in what you're studying and make sure you know where you're getting it. That's an important part. I'm alarmed by the crackdown that we see on fake news, and this desire to have one state, and I think it was Colorado, has passed a law that you have to be licensed by the state to be a journalist, and that is alarming. That is extremely alarming. So you have to say, I'm gonna be a real news station, and I'm gonna apply for my license like you would, I guess, an electrician, I really don't know. And they have started licensing journalists, and that is really scary to me. We have a touch of it at the legislature because there's one organization that controls who has access to the press room there. The leadership has tried to work around it by holding events on the main red stairs so that those who are not approved by the Press Association, the Capitol Press Corps, can attend press events. The Capitol Press Corps decides who gets a press badge. And if they hold events in the press room, the Capitol Press Corps decides who can attend. So we've seen leadership start having it out, like in front of the red stairs or in some of those other areas, and they've been able to work around for groups, not just us, other groups that are not in Capitol Press Corps. But the Capitol Press Corps has shrunk. It used to be, when I started covering North Carolina news, it was about maybe 30 people. I think we're down to about 9. So it's a pretty small group, and to have 9 people, the only ones licensed, sort of, that's a strong word, but licensed to cover the legislature is really alarming. So Freedom House report made some recommendations. I think they're a little bit pie in the sky, but certainly this is post-COVID recommendations for how we should be looking at a free press. One of them is that emergency measures are accountable, proportionate, and time restricted. North Carolina's addressed that with the emergency order to a degree. Time restricted, I would like to see that with public records, that they are time restricted and how long they have to respond to us. Emergency measures are proportionate and accountable. I'm not positive that our emergency measures during the COVID pandemic were either of those things. Certainly time will tell, and we'll get a chance to look at the data if it's ever made available to us. The other was provide technical support and training for online work. In this arena, they're saying for journalists. Certainly it'd help other industries too, but for journalists, a lot of journalists just sort of threw in the towel and turned on WREL like everyone else and didn't know what else to do because there was not an infrastructure. There was not an infrastructure to promote a free press, make sure they could pay their folks, make sure they had access to photographs of data and information. Ensuring a free and independent media can thrive and have access to fact-based information, that's exactly what we're talking about. These recommendations are things to be taken into a potential next crisis. And combat corruption in pandemic response efforts. We're starting to see that unfold now, particularly with some of the districts cracking down on PPP loans and some of these, when the money was flowing, everybody had their hand in it. So we're trying as much as we can to report those arrests and those investigations. There's going to be a lot, and there's already been a lot, there's gonna be a lot more, and we don't always have access to that information. So these recommendations are an important part of preparing this free press for the economic freedom that we already enjoy, because really free press plays an important role in this. And we're really going to be struggling, I think, as we move forward, particularly as revenue and the press really tries to make a decision about how they're going to move forward into the next economy. I think a lot of them are starting to narrow what they cover. We're very focused on state government. You're going to find areas that are very focused on industry, and I think that's where it's going to be. People are going to start carving out slices of the news market, so that they can start, really focusing and digging deep. Because in our numbers, people are tired of the quick stories. They are looking for podcasts and YouTube videos and things like that. So people are engaging more with news. Subscribers are up for a lot of people. There was a real push towards making all content free. The post-COVID bump in subscribers is continuing for most organizations because it's the way people are getting higher quality stuff as they become inundated with just bad ad-riddled content, and they don't have time for it. So I would say we're going to see an increase in that in subscriber-based news. So as we all, the more prosperous we are as a nation, the more access we will have to outside news sources and be able to really pick and choose where we're getting our information and be able to focus. If you're interested in regulatory reform for the state government, then you'll be able to find just that. So I'm a free market. I think the best will bubble up, and more is better because people are educated consumers, but economic freedom and press freedom are inextricably combined, and it's something that will benefit everyone, not just North Carolina. Thank you. Any questions? Yes.
Okay, so I have 2.
Okay.
The first one is there good model legislation for how a state can improve its public records laws? And is that something you can talk about? And then second, quickly, can you talk about Substack as
Yes.
In its place in journalism?
Absolutely. I think, well, look, first, the federal government's record laws are better than ours right now. So that exists already. And they also have a lot more money to fill those records requests. And we would like to offer training to grassroots groups on how to write them and how to work with them, but we're finding that we can't train people because we don't have any example of what works. They don't send anything. So that's our biggest difficulty right now. We set out this big plan to start training grassroots groups on how to use public records. We can't get them to answer ours. So how can we train anybody? Federal government responds quickly because their laws are a little tighter. They have requirements on response, and I do find that they keep coming back. They keep asking for a more narrow window of what information you need. So you can't be on a fishing expedition. You have to be looking for one needle in a haystack, and that's just not always realistic.
And are there no states that have good laws that they
There really are not. Colorado is I keep going back to Colorado, but they have one that's a little tighter than ours. But we definitely need reform here. Substack is a tremendous asset. I use it a lot actually, and it's given an outlet for reporters who may have been in one of those 350 newsrooms around the state that went under to stay in the business. Now you're not going to get rich off of it, certainly, but it provides us an opportunity to reach writers who can contribute to our publication and to our readers' base of knowledge, and it really gives an opportunity for that. But it's like having a part-time legislature. You're going to get people who are new in the business, or independently wealthy, or retired with another income. So it's not drawing from that sort of middle group who are, middle business, middle industry, middle career.
Can you explain what Substack is?
Absolutely.
For
Sure, it's a blogging site for the most part, but it's actually more than blogging. It's a news site where everybody can individually own their own page. So for example, AP Dillon, who's with the North State Journal, but she also has her own Substack called More to the Story. She's a great example of someone who has used that to her advantage. She breaks news on there all the time, and it's a great opportunity to get in there and read. Now again, it's like walking into a warehouse, a Costco of news. You got to be able to dig through and find the right thing and find the people that you trust. And I would say she's one of them, but we find a lot of writers are turning to that. Brian Anderson used to be with WRAL, and he has now started a Substack, a subscription-based Substack. And we talk to him a lot about stories. He'll break something and we'll bring him on and say, tell us more. And it helps promote his too. So, free market, right? Yeah.
Thanks, Ms. King, for the information.
Sure.
It's disappointing that the North Carolina government's getting outcompeted by the feds.
Sure.
Recommending.
It's odd.
Yeah, that's strange. So with YouTube, they started to roll back some of the policies around disinformation and whatnot.
Sure.
So is that having an implication on what are the implications on that at the institutional level of press freedom, and then also you're talking about these smaller shops that are starting to pop up.
Yep.
So I don't know if you're familiar with Valuetainment, Miami area. It exploded over the last 3
Right.
years. But they did an interview last week, and basically in the conversation said there's been an eclipse where people are starting to get canceled and they're getting more famous at getting canceled
Right.
than they were prior. So
Yes.
basically that power has been overplayed, and it's unclear what the implications are of that in terms
Sure.
of cancel culture. So just on the YouTube and on the cancel culture, what do you think in terms of press?
I think that first rolling back those restrictions has done two things. One, it's been helpful because there's more information out there and their algorithms aren't pushing people down as readily as they used to be. I am finding now people getting canceled is not always a bad thing because you can blow it up in lots of different ways, which again, we're back to the more platforms you have, the better you are, because if you're canceled on one or temporarily pushed down on one, you can blow it up on the other and get more information. So it's learning to use and manipulate what's available to you. I do think that the bubble has burst on that effort because people know what it is now. When you push down a Facebook post or a Facebook page, or you promote only paid ads, or you push down for ideological reasons, what was happening in YouTube, particularly during COVID, people now, I think, have their number. They know what's going on, and it has given legitimacy to perhaps ones that shouldn't, but it's also been given more access to information, and I think that's always a good thing. But you do see a lot more people looking forward to getting canceled. Every news organization I am aware of and have talked to, everyone has a contingency plan for being deplatformed. So that's what that means. If your Facebook page is taken down, your YouTube YouTube channel is taken down, you've been deplatformed. So most of the news organizations all have a contingency plan for that, which is why that earned audience is important. Subscribers, email lists, things like that, because that's your backup plan. You can reach your earned audience quickly if you're deplatformed. Even if you don't reach an organic audience, you can reach out to your loyal followers and loyal friends. Yeah.
I'm gonna ask a question. One of the things I've been concerned with news is tone,
Sure.
and very rarely does it go neutral.
Right.
It's always to the extreme. Like Weather Channel, it's the worst storm ever, but it's just a rainstorm.
Right.
But it's the worst ever, and we could not survive this.
Right.
But news works the same way, and then algorithms will take a person who believes something, and they'll take them down whatever rabbit hole they
Sure.
need to go. So my point being is, how do we get information without going down a rabbit hole? We're not experts on every story out there. We're just consumers
Sure.
trying to get a reasonable idea of what's going on.
Sure. I mean, what I do personally is I don't watch local TV news. I mean, for the most part, I just don't. And if I want to know what's happening in weather, I go to the Weather Channel or I go to the National Weather Service. Original source, just like they taught you in college and high school, go to the original source, read the bill, and go to the National Weather Service. That's what I do. I have local news on in the background sometimes. There's a cute dog or whatever, but for the most part, I go to the original source.
Well, I'm concerned I brought up the Weather Channel, but I was just using an example. It could be anything. It could be a bill that's coming
Sure.
up. It could be somebody being arrested and tried for
Right.
something. It could be presidential candidates. Everything's
Sure.
to the extreme. It's very difficult to get neutral information, just to be able to make a decision.
No.
Might be me.
No, but again, the original source is it, right? We link to, and I think we're one of very few that link to the original bill. We don't link to another story on our website. So, for example, if you go into some other network or other news outlets, they will link to another story because they want to keep you in that loop of their website, right? We link to another story somewhere else, but we also always link to the original bill. So you can go through, don't read the bill digest, don't read the WRAL coverage or whatever it is. I've said them twice, I probably shouldn't do that. But we link to the original bill.
Okay.
And that is a critical piece of that equation because the original source is important, like being able to read the economic index yourself or being able to read what the legislator intended. You may remember several years ago there was a bill proposed, the very last line was proposing making an official state religion. I don't know if you remember that, years ago. And everything else in the bill made complete sense. And then when you got down to the very bottom, but nobody saw it until somebody read the actual bill. And that's something that is an important piece of the puzzle when we're covering the state legislature. So find an outlet that takes you to the source rather than back into their website.
Could you describe where the Carolina Journal fits in the landscape
Sure.
of North Carolina journalism? I mean, are you invited to be at those Capitol meetings
Sure.
and so forth? You could just put it.
Of course. So we're not always invited, but we always show up. So that's something that we have carved out a slice of legislative coverage that is state government, executive, judicial, and legislative from a free market liberty perspective. And carving out that niche has really helped us stay relevant in this and draw readers that maybe don't have other options when they're digging around and trying to figure out where to get that original source. It's given us a unique opportunity to speak very directly to a reader who understands legislation, who understands what the dynamics are, who know who the associate justices of the North Carolina Supreme Court are. It's a very different kind of reader, but again, it's getting into specialization, and that's true in any industry to really grow, and we've been able to do that. And we've found that even though we are relatively small in the larger market, we've got an outsized influence and readership. We may not have as many eyes, but the eyes we have are decision makers and likely voters, active, engaged people in the community. So that carving out that slice has been an important piece to us.
Well, I got two questions.
Sure.
I'm subscribed to Epic Times.
Oh, good.
I'm
Okay.
familiar
Yes.
with them.
Oh,
I
absolutely. Me
really
too.
like them. And in fact, if you're concerned about communism, subscribe to Epic Times. It was started by people that escaped communism in China.
Sure.
So anyway, highly recommend them. And so I want to know what you thought about Epic Times.
I'm a subscriber too.
Second thing- Okay, you love them too, okay. And I don't watch any of the mainstream media either.
Sure.
I just Epic Times. But I follow a lot of people on Rumble and Getter.
Mhm.
It's the alternatives, which are much better
Right.
today than YouTube and Facebook. You just can't, it's
Right.
propaganda, too much of it. Another thing is Tucker Carlson. What do you think
Yes.
about what happened there?
You know, that's a tough one because I know him personally from a prior job. So I think that he had a tremendous following. I think it was a mistake. I think that they could have used that to their advantage and really, I put it in the same category as Bud Light's decision. You know, they stepped on their core viewer in that process, whether they agreed with it or not. You know, you can't throw out your good customer to try and attract a new one, and I think that's what they did. Yes.
I'm wondering, what do you make of how quiet the Press Association is
Mhm.
in litigation? They used to
Sure.
be fairly active on things like the public records law and
Right.
open meetings laws, and especially during COVID, it was like they disappeared. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts.
Sure.
on that.
That's a really good point because I would have thought, just like you, that this would have been their moment to step forward as the voice for the press in North Carolina, and everybody went home. Everybody went home. Everybody started a Substack. Everybody blogged and I don't know what happened. I think just as an organization, they went with what was the standard line coming out of the state government, and they were afraid of any alternative to that. And I also think there's a generational turnover there, just like there were. I don't think that the true investigative journalists with that healthy skepticism is in those groups that are running that mainstream organization. I think that skepticism and the more grizzled journalists among us, me included, are actually at smaller publications. I think that we've started our investigative efforts on our own, or we've gone to other groups. Those mainstream outlets, which are the Press Association, they have rotating boards and presidents that come out of those mainstream groups. They have grown up with a different kind of perspective on journalism than what I had being older in the industry. Yeah.
Do you think that the smaller specialty
Sure.
press,
Right.
do you think that they would have greater stomach for litigation?
I
To
do.
the extent that
Absolutely.
if we can't get the legislature to change the public records law,
Sure.
let's see what we can do to get the courts to enforce what we have. Do you think that
Right.
there's a sense
I
that
do.
that might?
And I do, but there's also there's a downside to everything. Nonprofit journalism is still paying their folks. They're still keeping the lights on. They're still doing all those things. So finding one that is truly interested in a free press, and particularly as it relates to a free economy, sees that connection and sees the importance for future generations. So you have to be of the right mindset to participate, and you want those who are, not those who are just after one political gotcha and they don't like that they can't get this one document, that they're understanding that whatever precedent they're setting through that litigation could work against them and could be for them going forward. So it's really going to take a very special group to do something like that, or a set of groups. Yes.
Yeah, so you said that the Carolina Journal is free, right?
Yes.
So how do you get your money?
Sure.
And is it through donations, or how are you funded?
Sure. So we're donor driven, and we don't talk about who our donors are. We don't know our donors. The only one I know for sure is me. I'm one of them. So we are donor driven. We are going to start, I think, selling ads. We're going to try and set up a way to monetize our products because there are statistics that show that people are more or are less resistant to advertising now, particularly as they come to understand how the market works, and they're frustrated with the disappearance of a lot of news. People are statistically more willing to watch ads to see content. So we may try to figure out a way to monetize it in that way, but we are donor supported, just like lots of other nonprofit journalism outlets around the country. There's more and more popping up in North Carolina every day. Yeah.
Right, so we just talked about the number of newspapers we have.
Sure.
And then how quickly they've gotten very small.
Right.
Even the ones that survive, they're shells.
And they're weeklies sometimes.
Yeah, and they're shells of what they were. There's very little content from that area even.
Right, right.
So what do you do if you're some rural county and, you've got county seed, you've got bills that are being, how do you get that information out
Sure.
if no one is reporting on it?
Right.
And certainly that could cause all sorts of challenges.
It is, it's a huge challenge. I mean, we provide content for them, but we're not in Rockingham or in whatever county they're working on. A lot of them do create that coverage by printing things like the agenda or the minutes from a county commissioner meeting, or having, one or two interns come in, and, it's going younger and younger, but you usually have one or two editors who are covering everything. And so it's gotten smaller and smaller, and they focus on beats, but they're also consolidating, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. You'll have one reporter who has a region of 4 or 5 counties, and they go to every county commissioner meeting, or they have a lot more op-eds, which isn't a bad thing. A lot of people, we used to see op-eds as filler. I don't think they're a bad thing. I really get a lot of good news information out of an op-ed, and so you'll see more and more of those in paper.
Hey, Donna. So, as you've talked about the narrowing sources of journalist or information, I guess you could say,
Right.
media information, that of course we've all seen when you look at the ABC, NBC, CBS, and they've all maybe changed a comma or a word and come up with the same story. Somebody's coming up with that source.
Right.
So, if you have any insight on that, that'd be cool for just to
Right.
know. Who do you think is coming up with that source? And then, are you at all optimistic that there will be a balance of information available to people in the future because of obvious bias that we see, for
Sure.
example, in the national media?
Sure. So the first one, I really think that it's starting with journalism schools. The people who are drawn to economic freedom and studying bottom line numbers and how to run budgets are not drawn to journalism. It's just not the same person. And that's what I'm finding, is that when we hire somebody for the Carolina Journal, for example, they're not a journalism major for the most part. It's just we don't think the same things are news. We don't think the same things are important when we see a story. And so the people who are graduating and being hired as journalists are not necessarily the same people who will cover a state government meeting or be concerned about a debt ceiling or see a budget or a government is spending too much. It's just not the same person. So the way we've combated it individually at Carolina Journal is to not hire journalism majors, because they're not going to have the same values as for the most part that we have, and the kind of things that our readers are interested in. So that would be the first one. When you're tweaking a headline and it's written by somebody who doesn't have your mindset, they're going to just see the story differently. It may not be intentional, they'll just see it differently. Now, whether there will be enough information, I think so. I really do. I think the market sets itself. The market works itself out. It does in all the other cases, as long as the government stays out of it. When the government starts licensing people and starts creating these rules and starts, really stepping on the media, that's when it gets becomes a problem. I think as long as they let the market grow, readers are smart. They know what they're looking for. They're looking for the information that's not being hidden from them, pushed down in algorithms. I feel like the market will work itself out. People will vote with their feet. I mean, going back to the Bud Light thing, not one brick thrown, not one window broken.
Yeah.
And it was probably the strongest protest that I've seen in years. And that's what's going to happen. I think that people will be able to get the information they need by just letting it all exist and fight for the eyeballs.
Super. Unless there's any other questions, I guess we'll just give you a big round of applause.
Oh, yeah.
I was just gonna ask if
Yeah,
people
of course.
are interested in supporting Free Press, is there a national association or anything that has been
You can always
organized?
donate to the John Locke
You can always do that, yes. The John Locke Foundation is the parent organization of Carolina Journal, and there are lots of other nonprofit journalism groups. I think that one of the ways you could do it would be to reach out to the North Carolina Press Association and say, I'd like to see you get involved in reforming our public records laws and including nonprofit journalism, nonprofit outlets in your Capitol Press coverage, because there's really no excuse for not having groups like us or another group that's on the left even in the press corps, because it's the only way you're going to get fair coverage is by letting everybody in the door.
I'm not sure everybody here knows.
Sure.
When we had the COVID lockdown.
Right.
And Governor Cooper and they had all the press conferences,
Yes.
but they're all virtual.
Right.
Why don't you share how they call
Oh, yeah.
news media?
So this has been an ongoing battle, even pre-COVID. But the way during COVID, when we had press conferences, no one was allowed in the building, and that was a convenience. That worked out really well for them, because then all they really had to do was call the reporters that they wanted to invite, and they would. And there was a code to log in. And they had a WebEx, and if you didn't get that code, then you weren't able to cover it. That is not a free press, which is why we're yellow. You know, things like that were happening all over the country, but it was particularly happening here. And I have never, I think, I've been covering this maybe 10 years, covering the state government 10 years, I have never had a response outside of Twitter from someone in Cooper's office to a comment, to asking to be on their newsletter list, asking to be invited to their press conferences. I can't get anybody that works for me invited to anything because they've just decided that we're not an organization worth having in the room. And I think that's dangerous, because that means that, you know, if there's a change of seat in the governor's office, there's going to be a lot of pressure to make sure from the other side that they're invited. So I think that that's something that the North Carolina Press Association could get involved in. But absolutely, there has been absolutely no effort to include a wide range of journalists, particularly during COVID. One example I'll give real quick, I know we got to move on. There was a hearing, and we got the code from another journalist who was like, this is not fair that y'all aren't being included. And he gave us the code, and we had a reporter call from his cell phone, but his name popped up. And so he was let in for about 20 seconds, and then he was dropped. So it's an ongoing battle just to get in the room. So, you know, it's
Donna,
kind of a fun battle.
Can you give a shameless plug for John Locke's In the Pines movie, please?
How fun is that? Okay, so John Locke Foundation has created it's a docudrama about the Wilmington riots, and it is called In the Pines, and we're going to be having a screening of it. We've had several screenings already. It's already won awards. It's just an amazing production with the John Locke Foundation and all that they've been doing to cover this in a fair way, because I really feel like the Wilmington riots have not gotten fair coverage, fair education, and a real history lesson in North Carolina. It really should be at the national level, but at least North Carolina students should be able to see it. And we're going to be having a screening here, right?
Right,
Yes.
July 19th.
Yes.
With Boston Society here at the McGregor Downs.
Absolutely. So don't miss it. But it really is fantastic, and it's been so fun to watch them do that out of our office.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Donna. Yeah, sometimes these things get pushed together, Chip, a little bit last second, but we are putting on a joint event with John Locke here at the McGregor Downs, and it's going to be in the other room. Actually, it's a bigger room. They have a bigger television screen, and that movie is about 25 minutes long, I guess, right? So we're looking forward to that. It's on July 19th. It's actually a third Wednesday, which is a little off. It's a third Wednesday, not a second Wednesday. So keep an eye out on the website. Ted?
The gentleman next to me was asking, is that the only way you can watch In the Pines?
Oh.
We're actually planning. We had one screening already in Cary. This one, and there's probably going to be others. And is that on YouTube? I'm not sure.
So that's the question. Is it going to be on YouTube?
It's going to be eventually. I'm not sure if it is yet.
Yeah, so we are looking forward to that. We're also in the fall going to be having a gentleman speaking on Brian. What group is he with?
Brian Jodeci, he's from the Parents for Educational Freedom, North Carolina, talking about choice in education here in North Carolina. Opportunity scholarships, vouchers.
That's the state
Yeah.
emergency.
Yes, I don't know the entire content, but I know he's gonna be covering choice in K-12 education.
Right, so school choice is a huge issue. And then in October, we have our illustrious Professor Michael Munger. He's going to be talking about getting rid of the ABC Commission. And then in November, a special event, I think something's really, really pertinent to today, which is Jen LaGreca is a novelist, and she wrote a book called Just the Truth. And it's about a journalist who takes on the president of the United States, who's trying to implement a national election scheme. And she wrote that in 2019, right before the whole issue in 2020. So that's going to be really cool. That's actually going to be a screening. It's also, I think we're going to have it in the other room. I haven't checked with the powers that be, but I think we're going to have that in the other room. So bring popcorn, because that movie's going to be a little longer. But we also, we're going to be taking on ESG. We're taking on medical ethics in the spring. We got a lot of really cool speakers. Thank you very much for coming. If you are one of those folks who donated, really appreciate it. Every little bit helps for our honorarium and also just for this facility. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful evening.